The morning sun shone through the large windows of the old courthouse. The light filled the waiting area where Thomas Wilson sat quietly on a wooden bench. Thomas was 42 years old with short brown hair that showed a little gray at the sides. His Royal Guard uniform was clean and pressed perfectly. The dark blue fabric with its bright buttons made him stand out among the people in regular clothes. Thomas checked his watch again. It was almost 9 o'clock. He had been up all night working. His eyes felt heavy, but he sat up straight as he had been taught in his training. For over 20 years, Thomas had served in the Royal Guard. His job was to protect important people and keep everyone safe at big events. He was good at his job and took it very seriously. Today was different, though. Thomas wasn't here to guard anyone. He was here because he had gotten a ticket for driving too fast 3 weeks ago. He had been rushing to work that day because another guard had called in sick. The police officer who stopped him had been polite but firm. Now Thomas had to appear before a judge to explain what happened. The night before had been very busy. A foreign ambassador had come to visit, and Thomas had been assigned to the protection team. He had stood guard for 12 hours straight, watching every person who came near the ambassador. It was tiring work that required total focus. When his shift finally ended at 7 in the morning, Thomas had barely enough time to wash his face and change into a fresh uniform before heading to court. In his rush, Thomas had forgotten something important. His service rifle was still strapped across his shoulder. It was standard equipment for his job, and he was so used to carrying it that he didn't even notice its weight anymore. But weapons were not allowed in court, and Thomas had no idea he was breaking this rule. The large clock on the wall ticked loudly as Thomas waited for his name to be called. Around him, other people whispered to each other or looked at their phones. A young mother tried to keep her little boy from running in the hallway. An old man with a cane sat near the door, looking nervous. None of them seemed to notice Thomas's rifle. It was partly hidden by his coat, and people were too busy with their own problems to pay attention. All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Hargrove, a loud voice suddenly called out. People quickly stood up as the courtroom doors opened. Thomas saw a woman in her 60s with silver hair and glasses walk to the front of the room. She wore a black robe that almost touched the floor when she walked. Her face looked serious and strict as she sat down at her big desk. Thomas Wilson, the court clerk called out. Case number 47,823, traffic violation. Thomas took a deep breath and stood up. He straightened his uniform one last time and walked toward the front of the courtroom. As he moved, several people finally noticed the rifle on his shoulder. Their eyes widened, and a few stepped back to make more room for him to pass. Thomas still didn't realize anything was wrong. He stopped at the small wooden table in front of the judge's desk. Only then did he see Judge Hargrove's face change. Her eyebrows went up, and her mouth formed a tight line. She was staring right at his shoulder where the rifle hung. The whole room became very quiet. People stopped shuffling papers or whispering. Everyone could feel that something unusual was about to happen. Thomas stood tall, waiting for the judge to speak, completely unaware that he had just created a serious problem. Judge Hargrove's eyes were fixed on the rifle hanging from Thomas's shoulder. Her face turned a light shade of red, and she leaned forward in her big chair. The wooden gavel in her hand tapped twice on the desk, making a sharp sound that echoed in the silent room. Mr. Wilson, Judge Hargrove said in a cold voice, are you aware that weapons of any kind are strictly forbidden in my courtroom? She spoke slowly, putting stress on each word. Her glasses slid down her nose a little as she looked at Thomas over the top of them. Thomas felt confused for a moment. Then his eyes widened as he finally understood what was happening. He looked down at his shoulder and saw his service rifle hanging there. His heart began to beat faster. How could he have forgotten? It was a serious mistake to bring a weapon into a court of law. Thomas knew the rules, but in his tired state after working all night, the thought had never crossed his mind. Your Honor, Thomas started to speak, but the judge held up her hand to stop him. Bailiff, Judge Hargrove called to the uniformed court officer standing by the wall. "Please approach Mr. Wilson and secure that weapon immediately." The bailiff, a tall man with a serious face, walked quickly toward Thomas. The people in the seats behind them watched with wide eyes and open mouths. Some took out their phones, but another court officer walked around telling them that no pictures or videos were allowed in the courtroom. As the bailiff came closer, Thomas carefully lifted the strap of his rifle from his shoulder. He handled the weapon with practiced care, keeping the barrel pointed down at all times. The bailiff took the rifle from him and stepped back, checking that the safety was on before walking away with it. Thomas stood straight again, his face hot with embarrassment. He knew he had made a terrible first impression on the judge. In his 20 years of service, he had always been careful to follow rules and show respect to people in authority. Now he looked like someone who didn't care about the court's rules. "Now, Mr. Wilson," Judge Hargrove continued, her voice still stern and disapproving, "would you care to explain why you thought it appropriate to bring a loaded weapon into my courtroom?" She folded her hands on the desk in front of her and waited. Thomas took a deep breath. He could feel everyone watching him. The young mother from the hallway was now sitting in the back row, holding her little boy on her lap. The old man with the cane had a worried look on his face. Even the court clerk had stopped typing to watch what would happen next. "Your Honor," Thomas began again, his voice steady despite his embarrassment. "I want to apologize for my serious mistake. There is no excuse for bringing a weapon into your courtroom, and I take full responsibility for my actions." Judge Hargrove's expression didn't change. She continued to stare at Thomas, waiting for more of an explanation. A clock ticked loudly on the wall, counting the seconds of uncomfortable silence. However, Thomas continued, "I would like to explain how this mistake happened, if you will permit me." He stood tall, his hands at his sides, looking directly at the judge without flinching. Judge Hargrove nodded once. "You may proceed, Mr. Wilson, but make it brief. My courtroom is busy today, and you have already disrupted our normal proceedings." Thomas nodded respectfully. He knew that what he said next might determine whether he faced a simple warning or much more serious consequences. The entire room seemed to lean forward slightly, waiting to hear what the royal guard would say to defend his unusual and troubling mistake. Thomas stood tall in front of Judge Hargrove. The whole courtroom was quiet. Everyone wanted to hear what he would say. Thomas looked tired, but his eyes were clear and honest. "Your Honor," Thomas began in a respectful voice, "last night, I was on duty protecting the visiting ambassador from Japan. My shift started at 7 in the evening and ended at 7 this morning. It was a long night, and we had a security alert around 2 in the morning that turned out to be false, but it kept us all on high alert." Judge Hargrove listened without changing her stern expression. She tapped her pen on her notepad, waiting for Thomas to get to the point. "When my shift ended this morning, I had exactly 45 minutes to make it to this court appearance," Thomas continued. "I rushed home, washed my face, and put on a fresh uniform. In my hurry and exhaustion, I simply forgot that my service rifle was still with me." A few people in the courtroom nodded in understanding. Many of them knew what it was like to work long hours and make mistakes when tired. A woman in a nurse's uniform seemed especially sympathetic, probably because she understood shift work. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Hargrove spoke up, her voice still cold. "Tiredness is not an excuse for breaking such an important rule. Many people work long hours, but they don't bring dangerous weapons into courtrooms." She adjusted her glasses and looked down at some papers on her desk. "Your record shows you've been a royal guard for over 20 years. Surely in that time you've learned to be more careful." Thomas nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, you're absolutely right. I have no excuse, only an explanation. I've never made this mistake before in my 20 years of service." The judge looked up from her papers. "That may be true, Mr. Wilson, but rules exist for a reason. What makes you think you deserve special treatment today?" Her voice had an edge to it now. Some people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thomas took a deep breath. This was not going well. He had hoped the judge would understand his situation, but she seemed determined to make an example of him. He needed to be completely honest now. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice becoming stronger, "I don't believe I deserve any special treatment. I know I broke a rule, and I accept whatever consequences you decide are fair." The judge raised her eyebrows slightly, perhaps surprised by his direct acceptance of responsibility. Thomas continued, "But I would like to explain something about my job and why this mistake happened. It's not an excuse, just something I hope you'll consider." Judge Hargrove looked at the clock on the wall. She seemed to be deciding whether to let him continue or just hand down her decision. After a moment, she nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Wilson, but please be brief." Thomas nodded gratefully. "Your Honor, as a royal guard, my rifle becomes almost a part of me during my shift. We train thousands of hours with our weapons. After 12 hours of constant alertness, watching every person who comes near the ambassador, checking every unusual sound or movement, the line between duty and normal life sometimes blurs." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the young child who had been fidgeting earlier was still, sensing the seriousness of the moment. "Last night," Thomas said, his voice becoming softer but still clear enough for everyone to hear, "I prevented what could have been a serious security incident. A person tried to enter a restricted area with fake credentials. Because I was alert and followed my training, that person was stopped and questioned." Judge Hargrove leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly growing despite her stern demeanor. "And what happened with this person, Mr. Wilson?" she asked. Thomas looked directly at the judge, his face showing the weight of his responsibility. "That's what I wanted to explain next, Your Honor, if you'll allow me to continue." "Please continue, Mr. Wilson," Judge Hargrove said, gesturing with her hand. The stern look on her face had softened just a little. The people in the courtroom leaned forward in their seats. Thomas nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor. As I was saying, last night, a person tried to enter a restricted area where the ambassador was staying. This person had fake papers that looked very real. Most people would have been fooled." "But you weren't fooled?" the judge asked, her eyes now fixed on Thomas's face. "No, Your Honor. Something didn't seem right. The way this person moved, the way they avoided eye contact. Small things that most people wouldn't notice. But after 20 years as a guard, you develop a sense for these things." Thomas spoke clearly and simply, not trying to make himself sound like a hero. "What did you do?" Judge Hargrove asked. She had completely forgotten about her busy schedule now. Even the court clerk had stopped typing to listen. "I politely asked the person to wait while I checked their papers more carefully. They got nervous and tried to push past me. That's when I had to use my training." Thomas stood straight as he spoke, his hands at his sides. "I stopped this person without using my weapon, Your Honor. We held them for questioning." "And who was this person?" The judge was now fully interested in the story. The whole room waited for Thomas's answer. "I'm not allowed to share all the details, Your Honor. But I can tell you that this person was carrying hidden camera equipment and had plans of the building where the ambassador was staying. They were not there for a good reason." Thomas's voice was serious. A murmur went through the courtroom. People whispered to each other. The bailiff had to raise his hand to quiet them down. Judge Hargrove took off her glasses and cleaned them with a small cloth from her desk. It gave her time to think about what she had just heard. When she put her glasses back on, she looked at Thomas with new eyes. "Mr. Wilson, what you did last night was commendable. You potentially stopped a serious security threat." Her voice was a bit warmer now. "But I still don't understand why this relates to bringing a weapon into my courtroom today." Thomas took a deep breath. This was the hard part to explain. "Your Honor, after something like that happens, a guard stays on high alert. We call it being on the edge. Your body and mind don't just switch off when your shift ends. I was still partly in protection mode when I rushed to get here this morning." The judge nodded slowly, beginning to understand. For 12 hours, I was responsible for someone's life, Thomas continued. My rifle was a necessary tool for that job. When I left work this morning, my mind was racing with everything that had happened. I was thinking about the report I would need to write later today, about the security changes we would need to make, about the investigation that would follow. Thomas paused. In all that, I simply didn't register that I still had my rifle with me when I came to court. The old man with the cane in the back of the courtroom nodded in understanding. He wore a small pin on his jacket that showed he was a veteran. He knew what Thomas was talking about. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice firm but respectful, I want to be clear. I'm not using this as an excuse. I broke a rule, and I take full responsibility for that. If you decide I need to be punished, I accept that completely. Judge Hargrove studied Thomas's face for a long moment. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone could feel that this was an important moment. The judge seemed to be wrestling with her strict belief in rules and her growing respect for the man standing before her. Mr. Wilson, she finally said, leaning forward in her chair, let me ask you something different. What exactly do you think your rifle represents? Thomas looked at Judge Hargrove, surprised by her question. What did his rifle represent? No one had ever asked him that before. He thought carefully about his answer. The courtroom was so quiet that people could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The young mother in the back row held her breath. The court clerk's fingers hovered above the keyboard, waiting to type Thomas's words. Your Honor, Thomas began slowly, this rifle is not just a weapon to me. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at the judge. When I first joined the Royal Guard, they told us something important. They said, your weapon is not for you, it's for the people you protect. Judge Hargrove's eyes stayed fixed on Thomas. She didn't move or speak. For 20 years, Thomas continued, I've carried this rifle while protecting people who make our laws, who run our country, who visit our nation as guests. I've stood guard at hospitals, schools, and yes, even courthouses like this one. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he spoke. The tiredness seemed to fade from his face. This rifle represents a promise I made, a promise to put myself between danger and the people I'm sworn to protect. It represents my duty to keep others safe, even if that means I might get hurt. A few people in the courtroom nodded. One woman wiped a tear from her eye. The bailiff who had taken Thomas's rifle earlier looked down at the floor, thinking about his own service. Your Honor, when I carry this rifle, I'm not just a man with a gun. I'm a symbol of security and safety for people who need protection. Our ambassador sleeps peacefully because people like me stand watch. Children play freely in parks because people like me are ready to respond if danger comes. Thomas paused and took a deep breath. But most important, Your Honor, this rifle represents something I never want to use. In 20 years, I've never had to fire it outside of training. That's a point of pride for me. The best guard is one who keeps people so safe that his weapon stays silent. Judge Hargrove's face had changed completely. The stern, cold look was gone. Her eyes had softened, and she leaned forward with genuine interest. Mr. Wilson, she said quietly, in all my years on this bench, I've heard many explanations and excuses, but I've rarely heard someone speak with such honest conviction about their duty. She tapped her pen on her notepad, thinking, You've given me something to consider that I hadn't thought about before. The judge stood up from her chair. Everyone in the courtroom was surprised. Judges usually stayed seated during these kinds of cases. Mr. Wilson, I want to tell you something, Judge Hargrove said. Before I became a judge, my father was a police officer for 35 years. He carried his service weapon with the same sense of duty you just described. People in the courtroom looked at each other in surprise. The judge rarely shared personal details. One night, she continued, a man tried to attack my mother and me in a parking lot. My father was off duty, but he still had his weapon. He didn't even need to use it. Just showing it was enough to make the man run away. She paused, remembering. That night, I understood that sometimes weapons can protect without harming. Thomas stood respectfully as the judge spoke. He hadn't expected this turn in the conversation. "Your Honor, thank you for sharing that story," he said. "Your father sounds like an honorable man." Judge Hargrove nodded. "He was, and he would have understood your mistake today, even while believing in the importance of rules." She looked thoughtful for a moment, then asked, "Mr. Wilson, if you could go back to this morning, what would you do differently?" The question hung in the air. Everyone knew this was Thomas's chance to show if he had really learned from his mistake. His answer might determine what the judge decided to do about his case. Thomas looked at Judge Hargrove thoughtfully. Her question about what he would do differently was important. He knew he needed to answer honestly. "Your Honor," Thomas began, "if I could go back to this morning, I would have taken an extra minute to be fully present and aware of my surroundings." He spoke clearly and simply. "Even though I was tired and in a hurry, I should have followed the routine we learn in training. We call it the status check." "Status check?" the judge asked, curious about this term. "Yes, Your Honor. It's a quick mental checklist that guards are supposed to do whenever they change locations or situations." Thomas stood straight as he explained. "We check our equipment, our surroundings, and our mindset. If I had done my status check before entering the courthouse, I would have noticed my rifle and properly secured it." Some people in the courtroom nodded in understanding. Many of them had jobs with safety routines too. "The truth is, Your Honor, I didn't give myself that moment to switch from being a guard to being a regular citizen. That was my failure today." Thomas's voice was steady and honest. "I was physically present in your courtroom, but my mind was still back at my post." Judge Hargrove listened carefully. She seemed to appreciate his thoughtful answer. "And what will you do in the future, Mr. Wilson?" she asked. "How will you prevent this from happening again?" Thomas nodded, showing he understood the importance of her question. "3 things, Your Honor. First, I will never again rush from a shift directly to an important appointment without giving myself proper time to transition. Second, I will always do my status check before entering any public building, especially a courthouse." The judge waited for his third point. Thomas took a deep breath. "And third, Your Honor, I will share my mistake with the other guards during our next training session. My error can be a learning opportunity for everyone. No one should repeat what I did today." A murmur of approval went through the courtroom. People were impressed by Thomas's willingness to use his mistake to help others learn. Judge Hargrove's face showed a small smile for the first time. "That's a very responsible approach, Mr. Wilson. Using your error to teach others shows true leadership." She looked down at the papers on her desk, then back at Thomas. "I still have a duty to uphold the rules of this court. Bringing a weapon here was a serious violation, regardless of the reasons." Her voice was firm, but no longer cold. "However, I also believe in judging the whole person, not just the single action." The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone waited to hear what the judge would decide. "Mr. Wilson, I'm going to offer you a choice," Judge Hargrove said. "Option 1. I can give you a formal warning about bringing a weapon into court, and we can proceed with your traffic violation case as planned." Thomas nodded, waiting to hear the second option. "Or option 2. The judge continued, "You can come speak to our next Citizens Police Academy class about the importance of weapons safety and the responsibility that comes with carrying a service weapon. If you do that, I'll dismiss both the weapons violation and the traffic ticket." The people in the courtroom looked surprised. Judge Hargrove was known for being strict, not for offering creative solutions like this. Thomas didn't hesitate. "I would be honored to speak to the class, Your Honor. Sharing what I've learned today would be a privilege, not a punishment." Judge Hargrove nodded, pleased with his answer. "Very well. The class meets next Thursday evening at the community center. Be there at 6 o'clock." She picked up her gavel, ready to make her decision official. But before she could bring it down, something unexpected happened. The old veteran in the back of the room slowly stood up. His face showed respect for what he had just witnessed. No one had ever stood up in Judge Hargrove's courtroom without being asked to. The bailiff looked unsure about what to do. The judge paused, her gavel in midair, watching with surprise as the old man stood tall despite his cane. Everyone in the courtroom stared at the old veteran who had stood up. He was in his 80s, with white hair and a weathered face. His back was bent with age, but he stood as straight as he could, leaning on his wooden cane. The small pin on his jacket showed he had fought in Vietnam many years ago. "Sir," Judge Hargrove said, surprised by this break in courtroom rules, "please be seated. We're in the middle of a proceeding." The old man spoke in a voice that was quiet but clear. "Forgive me, Your Honor, but I need to say something." His hand trembled slightly as he held his cane. "I've sat in this courtroom many times over the years. I've seen you be fair and tough. But today, I've seen something special." The judge looked unsure about whether to stop him. This was unusual, but something made her wait and listen. "I carried a rifle for our country in Vietnam," the old veteran continued. "When I came home, people didn't understand what that meant. They didn't understand what we went through." He looked at Thomas with respect in his eyes. "But this man, he understands duty. He understands service. And most important, he understands responsibility." Another person stood up now, a middle-aged woman in a nurse's uniform. "Your Honor, my brother serves in the military. I know how hard it is for them to switch from duty mode to civilian life. What Mr. Wilson said about needing time to transition, that's real. My brother calls it rewiring your brain." Judge Hargrove looked around her courtroom in amazement. This had never happened before. She should stop it, but something told her to let it continue. A young man in the back row stood up next. He looked about 20 years old. "Your Honor, I'm starting police academy next month. I want to learn from people like Mr. Wilson, people who take their mistakes seriously and try to make things better. What he did today, admitting his error and wanting to teach others, that's the kind of officer I want to be." One by one, more people began to stand. A teacher, a bus driver, a store owner. Each one stood quietly, showing their respect for Thomas's honesty and sense of duty. No one spoke now. They simply stood, creating a powerful silent message. Thomas looked around in surprise. He had not expected this. He had come to court prepared to accept punishment, not to receive support from strangers. His eyes grew slightly wet, but he blinked quickly and maintained his dignified posture. The bailiff looked at Judge Hargrove, waiting for instructions. Should he make everyone sit down? The judge sat still for a long moment, taking in the extraordinary scene in her courtroom. Then, slowly and deliberately, Judge Eleanor Hargrove stood up from her chair. A judge standing for someone in their courtroom was almost unheard of. It was a sign of the highest respect. The clerk's mouth fell open in surprise. The bailiff's eyes widened. "In 30 years on this bench," Judge Hargrove said, her voice carrying throughout the now silent room, "I have seen many things, but rarely have I seen someone turn a mistake into a lesson with such dignity and honesty." She looked around at all the standing people. "It seems I'm not the only one who recognizes true character when I see it." Thomas stood at attention, overwhelmed by what was happening. His face showed his emotion, but he maintained his composure as he had been trained to do. "Mr. Wilson," the judge continued, "your traffic violation is dismissed. So is the matter of bringing a weapon into court." She paused, then added, "However, I still hope you'll speak to that Citizens Police Academy class. Not as a punishment, but because they would benefit greatly from hearing your perspective on duty and responsibility." Thomas nodded, his voice steadied despite his emotion. "I would be honored, Your Honor. Thank you." The judge looked around the courtroom one more time, taking in the extraordinary sight of all the standing people. Then she did something even more unexpected. She smiled broadly and brought down her gavel with a sharp crack. "This court is adjourned," she announced. And then she did something that had never been seen in her courtroom before. Judge Eleanor Hargrove began to applaud. The sound of Judge Hargrove's applause filled the courtroom. For a moment, Everyone stood frozen in surprise. No one had ever seen the strict judge act this way. Then the old veteran began to clap too, his weathered hands moving slowly but firmly. Soon everyone in the courtroom was applauding. The bailiff, the clerk, the people in the seats, even the young child on his mother's lap tried to join in with his small hands. Thomas Wilson stood tall, deeply moved by this unexpected show of respect. His eyes shone with emotion, but he maintained his dignified posture as he had been trained to do. 20 years of service had taught him how to stay composed even in the most surprising situations. As the applause finally died down, people began to gather their things. The court session was over. Judge Hargrove stepped down from her high desk and walked toward Thomas. This was another unusual move. Judges rarely spoke personally to people in their courtroom. "Mr. Wilson," she said, extending her hand, "I want to thank you for a valuable lesson today." Thomas shook her hand respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I believe I'm the one who learned the lesson." The judge smiled. "Perhaps we all did." She lowered her voice slightly. "My father would have been proud to meet someone like you. He always said that admitting mistakes was the mark of true character." Thomas nodded. "Your father sounds like a wise man. I would have been honored to meet him." As Judge Hargrove walked away, several people approached Thomas. The old veteran came first, moving slowly with his cane. "Son," he said to Thomas, "I served in the jungle 50 years ago. Different time, different war. But duty hasn't changed." He reached out his free hand. "Thank you for your service and for reminding everyone what it means." Thomas shook the man's hand firmly. "Thank you for your service, sir. Men like you paved the way for us." The young man who wanted to join the police academy was next. "Mr. Wilson," he said eagerly, "I'm starting training next month. Could I maybe talk to you sometime about what it means to serve? I want to do it right." Thomas smiled. "I'd be happy to talk with you. Here's my card. Call me next week, and we'll set something up." He handed the young man his business card, with the Royal Guard emblem on it. More people stopped to shake Thomas's hand or pat him on the shoulder as they left the courtroom. The nurse wished him well. The teacher asked if he might visit her classroom someday to talk to the children about responsibility. Thomas agreed to all these requests with humility and grace. As the courtroom emptied, the bailiff approached with Thomas's rifle. "Here you go, sir," he said, handing it back carefully. "And if you don't mind me saying, that was something special today. Never seen anything like it in 15 years working here." Thomas took his rifle and checked the safety automatically. "Thank you. I certainly didn't expect things to turn out this way when I walked in." The bailiff nodded toward the rifle. "You heading straight back to duty now?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I'm going to stop by the armory first and secure this properly. Then I'm going home to get some sleep before my next shift." He smiled slightly. "I think I've learned the importance of taking time for proper transitions." The bailiff laughed. "I'd say so. Take care, sir." As Thomas walked out of the courtroom, he noticed the small boy who had been sitting with his mother. The child looked up at Thomas with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a hero?" the little boy asked simply. Thomas knelt down to be at eye level with the child. "No," he said gently. "I'm just someone who tries to do his job well and learn from his mistakes. That's all any of us can do." The boy looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded as if Thomas had shared an important secret. Thomas stood up, nodded politely to the boy's mother, and continued walking. As he stepped outside the courthouse into the bright sunlight, he took a deep breath. It had been a most unexpected day. 1 week later, Thomas Wilson stood in front of a classroom at the community center. About 30 people sat in chairs, looking at him with interest. These were the students of the Citizens Police Academy class that Judge Hargrove had mentioned. Thomas wore his full Royal Guard uniform, freshly pressed and perfectly neat, but without his rifle. "Good evening," Thomas began, his voice clear and strong. "My name is Thomas Wilson. I've been a Royal Guard for 20 years. Judge Hargrove asked me to speak to you today about responsibility and weapons safety. At the back of the room, Thomas noticed Judge Hargrove herself sitting quietly. She nodded at him with a small smile. She had come to listen, not as part of her job, but because she wanted to hear what Thomas had to say. "I want to start by telling you about a mistake I made," Thomas said honestly. "Last week, I walked into a courtroom with my service rifle after a long night shift. It was against the rules, and I should have known better." The students listened carefully as Thomas told them the whole story. He didn't make himself sound like a hero. He simply told the truth about his mistake, the judge's questions, and what he had learned. "The most important thing I've learned in 20 years of service," Thomas explained, "is that carrying a weapon is never just about the weapon itself. It's about the responsibility that comes with it." A young woman raised her hand. "But how do you handle that responsibility every day? Isn't it stressful?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, it can be. That's why proper training is so important. That's why procedures and rules exist." He looked around the room. Rules like not bringing weapons into courtrooms aren't just arbitrary. They exist to keep everyone safe. For the next hour, Thomas answered questions about his job, his training, and the lessons he had learned. He spoke simply but with deep knowledge. The students asked thoughtful questions, and Thomas answered each one honestly. Near the end of the session, an older man asked, "What advice would you give to someone who carries a weapon for their job, or even for personal protection?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Remember that the goal is to never use it. In 20 years, I've never had to fire my weapon outside of training, and I'm proud of that. The best outcome is when everyone goes home safe." As the class ended, people came up to thank Thomas. Many wanted to shake his hand or ask more questions. Judge Hargrove waited until everyone else had spoken to him before approaching. "That was excellent, Mr. Wilson," she said. "You've given these people something valuable to think about." Thomas smiled. "Thank you for the opportunity, Your Honor. It means a lot that you came tonight." The judge nodded. "I wouldn't have missed it. By the way, how is your schedule these days? The Academy has asked if you might consider becoming a regular guest speaker." Thomas looked surprised. "Really? I'd be honored, as long as my commanding officer approves." "I've already spoken with him," Judge Hargrove said with a smile. "He thinks it's an excellent idea. Said something about community relations being important." As they walked out of the community center together, the judge asked, "So, have you been doing your status checks lately?" Thomas laughed. "Every time I enter a building, Your Honor. It's become a habit now." Outside, the old veteran from the courtroom was waiting by a car. Judge Hargrove had given him a ride to the class. He waved his cane slightly when he saw Thomas. "Good talk in there, son," he called out. "You made this old soldier proud." As Thomas drove home that evening, he felt content. His mistake had turned into something positive. Because he had admitted his error honestly, people had learned important lessons, not just about weapons safety, but about taking responsibility and treating others with respect. The next morning, Thomas reported for duty at his usual post. As he put on his uniform and secured his rifle properly, he smiled to himself. Life sometimes taught its most valuable lessons through mistakes. The important thing was to learn from them and move forward with greater wisdom. When his commanding officer stopped by later that day, he handed Thomas an envelope. "Congratulations, Wilson. You've been promoted to training supervisor. After that community center talk, we think you've got a lot to teach the new recruits." Thomas accepted the envelope with surprise and gratitude. His mistake had not ended his career. Instead, it had opened a new chapter, one where he could help others learn from his experience. As he stood tall at his post, Thomas Wilson felt more ready than ever to serve with honor, wisdom, and humility.